Good afternoon. As you are looking at this title, I'm sure the first thing that comes to your mind is how someone could come up with such a banality. So obviously, as we all know, movement is physical movement is the only way to get from point A to point B. It's well known that it's critical for our physical and emotional well-being. You can argue that it's equally essential for life, for survival. But as you may guess, I will talk today about different type of movement, social movement, movement of protest. And I would argue that it is equally critical for our survival as humans, especially today when the entire system of rights and freedoms, of protection of our rights and freedoms is facing an existential threat. This year we will mark the anniversary, the 70th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration was adopted in the aftermath of some of the most horrendous times in human history, in the aftermath of gas chambers and mass killings that we all know about. It was adopted to make sure that something like that never happens again. And of course, there is no doubt we've made a remarkable progress in the area of human rights protection in these 70 years. But unfortunately, in the last couple of years, this progress has been stalled, and I would even argue that it has been reversed. So these are the words of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who said that today the oppression is fashionable again, the security state is back, and fundamental freedoms are in retreat in every part of the world. And you don't need to be a human rights lawyer or even an activist to see it, to feel it. You cannot hide away from images from Syria or Yemen or Myanmar, where people are being slaughtered in thousands, where they're being raped, pushed away from their homes, starved to death. You hear your own leaders or leaders nearby using the rhetoric of hate, of discrimination, of xenophobia, of dehumanization, just to exploit their voters' sense of insecurity, of disenfranchisement. You see states like Russia and China undermining the very notion of universality of human rights. But what's worse, you hear their former opponents, states that, at least in rhetoric, used to stand up for human rights, join the same camp. And you may be living in a place where you don't necessarily need to run away from the bombs or survive in a refugee tent. But I would argue that you also feel this onslaught on human rights in your everyday life. Think of your right to privacy, especially online. Think of your access to information, your right to elect the leaders that you want without interference, your access to healthcare, to work. So, in other words, as I argued in an article that I wrote recently, I'm afraid that for human rights, the winter is coming. So the winter is coming, and I do believe that, as I said, it is the system of human rights protection that is facing an existential threat, and as a result, it's a threat to us as humanity. But there is also good news, and the good news is that at the same time as we saw this reversal, at the same time as leaders all over the world turned a blind eye to atrocities and refused to stand up for human rights, we saw in recent years, even in the last year, a new phenomenon. We saw the unprecedented growth of massive popular movements of people all over the world standing up and fighting back, people getting together for a variety of causes to stand up jointly for justice, for freedoms, for rights, for dignity. And when I say all over the world, I really mean it. In Zimbabwe, after decades of President Mugabe's oppressive rule, suddenly hundreds of thousands of people took to the street. And this man, who quite honestly nobody believed would ever leave office, was gone, just like that, as a matter of days. In the US, the Women's March was one of the largest protests since the 80s. And you might remember how hundreds of people just spontaneously showed up at the airports when Trump first introduced his discriminatory ban on refugees. In Bosnia, people got together to watch the last days of the trial in which Ratko Mladic, the Serbian general, was finally convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. It was an incredible moment. These people were no longer just victims of his atrocities. They were actors in this process that finally, it took decades, but finally they saw justice being done. In Australia, where the government claims that its abusive policy of sending refugees to offshore open-air prisons is something that the population wants, people basically said no. They repeatedly get out in the streets to not let the government hijack their voice, to say that in fact they do want refugees to come, they want to stand in solidarity with them. In Poland, every time the government is trying to introduce yet another repressive measure, be it the ban on abortions or very repressive judicial reforms, people take to the streets and they actually manage to stop these repressive actions from taking place. People get together, they mobilize for very different causes. Some of them have been never socially active before. But I think there comes a moment where everybody realizes that it's really up to them. What's more important, it works. It works, it works, it works. And I'm saying this with such conviction because I have actually seen it with my own eyes. I was born in the Soviet Union. And I was born in the Soviet Union when it was a totalitarian system that seemed completely unbreakable, just like many of the repressive regimes that we now see around the world. There was no sign of change. My parents would whisper in the kitchen when they discussed anything of political importance. We couldn't travel because my parents were not members of the Communist Party. We couldn't leave the country. My sister could not get into university because she decided to quit so-called Komsomol. It was the youth wing of the Communist Party that everybody was supposed to be a member of from the age of 14. I had to wear a red pioneer scarf and march and sing patriotic songs, and everything you saw on TV, in papers, in your school textbooks was nothing but communist propaganda. There were very few people. The number of people who believed that some kind of change is possible was very, very small, negligible. In fact, in 1968, to be exact, about 2 decades before I was born, this number was exactly 8. So what happened then was, and this is why we know the exact number, the events were unfolding in socialist Czechoslovakia. The events that were called Prague Spring. Those were very modest reforms, but the Soviet Union did not want to tolerate it, so they moved in with troops. And at that point, 8 Soviet citizens staged a protest on the Red Square in the heart of Moscow with this hand-written poster saying, which reads, "For your freedom and ours." As you can guess, the protest didn't last very long, about 3 minutes to be exact. They were immediately arrested, severely beaten up, and quickly sentenced to prison and exile or psychiatric treatment. And I grew up knowing, not the details, but the basic outline of this story, and never thinking that I would see anything else. But I did. This unbreakable system basically started crumbling and crushing in front of our eyes. And in 1991, when similar events unfolded, when Lithuania, one of the Soviet republics, decided to declare its independence, and again, Soviet troops moved in to stop it, it was no longer 8 people. The protest looked like that. It was hundreds of thousands of Russians, of Soviet citizens at that point. People who have never seen anything other than silence and repression, but enough was enough. And the government also realized that this is not something that they can discount. And as we all know, the system was gone. And while, trust me, I'm always devastated to see what's happening in Russia again, I can never forget what this wind of change, if you like, feels like. It was also the moment back then in Russia when I realized that every movement starts with an individual action, just one person taking a step, maybe not the obvious one, daring to do something different. And what happened was I was 19 years old then, by that time, and working on the radio station, learning the ropes of journalistic profession. And one day I got a call from a friend of mine, a mentor, if you like, who was a very well-known, mature journalist. And she asked for my help. And she asked for my help because she was sick and couldn't deal with it. So she called me up and said, here's the situation. So she was covering at that time the war in Tajikistan, one of the former Soviet republics. And she tells me the story about this family of 8 people with one of the older daughters is very pregnant, and they're stuck in this remote mountain village in Tajikistan, and they need to be evacuated because the village is about to be attacked. They cannot run away. And do you know what she asked me? She asked me to get a military plane to get them out. And as you can imagine, my first response to her was, you must be out of your mind. Where am I going to get you a military plane? It's not like you can rent one or charter one, just like that. And she just said, before you say no, why don't you try? You're a journalist, why don't you try? So I made some dozens of phone calls, found eventually some military airport outside of Moscow, kept calling them, and eventually they put me through to the medical ward because I think they just were convinced that I'm crazy and needed some attention. So, and that's where the miracle happened. And the miracle happened because the person on the other end of the line just happened to care. This person listened to me, didn't just dismiss me, and sprung to action. And then there were more phone calls and more letters now to the military headquarters. And believe it or not, 3 days later, because it was also urgent, 3 days later, a military plane actually went to Tajikistan. They got a truck, they got this family out, they brought them back to Moscow, and to safety. I spoke to them once after they came to Moscow. The baby was born safely. I think by now the baby must be in university. But for me, I feel like I always owe this Tajik family everything I stand for, what I do, why I'm standing in front of you talking about this today. Because I think they gave me this ultimate protection from despair, which is very common in my line of work. It is about taking injustice personally. Taking injustice personally is the founding principle of Amnesty International, the largest international human rights movement where I work now. It is about this idea that we can make people care about those who are near them or those who are thousands of miles away, and we can make them take action to do something about it. It is about the fact that everybody can actually contribute to this fight against injustice. And we can bring all these individual actions together to form a movement that is incredibly empowering to those who are part of it, and that has become the symbol of hope to thousands of people who probably wouldn't have hope otherwise. Every year, every month, every week, every day, millions of our members take actions. They write letters, they form human chains, they protest in front of the embassies. They come to the train station and airports to welcome refugees. And these actions save lives. They get people out of jails. They get people off the death row. They prevent them from being executed. They force governments to reverse repressive laws, to change practice. It is the idea that I find very, very powerful. It is the idea of bringing these individual actions together. But it all starts with just one person starting to care. And there are many reasons not to. There are so many reasons not to act. There is apathy, indifference, government propaganda, fake news, you name it. But I actually don't think we have a choice anymore. So in the remaining few seconds, I would just urge you to care, and then perhaps to dare. And I can assure you that if you care and dare, you'd be very surprised how much we can achieve if we move together, if we join together as a movement. Thank you.